welcome everyone to this end of the year Superhero Ethics Holiday Bonanza. Today we are going to be doing a end of the year wrap-up show in which Jacob and I talk about things that like you get on a lot of these shows. We're basically going to be doing a bunch of different top 5 lists. Some of our favorite things from the last year, some of the things we thought could have gotten better in the last year, both in terms of the content we saw and in our own podcast. And what are the 5 things we're most excited about going forward into next year? So I'm really excited to jump into this, and I'm hoping this will be a great end-of-the-year thing. I will warn you now, given editing schedule, you may be listening to this in the end of 2017. You may be listening to this early in 2018. But since years and dates are all artificial constructs anyway, somewhere in space it will still be 2017 when you are listening to this, so everything's okay. Jacob, how you doing as we come to the end of the year?
Well, I have a bit of a head cold, but other than that, I'm fine. I think that other parts of the galaxy maybe don't conceptualize 2017 as a thing, so I think it is possible that 2017 will cease to exist when the year rolls over.
I would say that's kind of a sad thought, but 2017 hasn't been the greatest year in some ways, so maybe that's not too bad. But either way, let's jump right into some of this kind of stuff. I want to start with our favorite characters. Who are our favorite characters of 2017? And the way we're going to do this is each one of us is going to list our top 5, just saying a couple quick sentences about each, and after each one we'll have a moment or two to discuss it before moving on to the next one. And then the other person will give their list. I imagine in some ways we're going to have a lot of overlap. Hopefully there'll be some ways in which we go apart. Jacob and I are not actually cloned from the same person, so our brains will hopefully diverge a little bit. But I'm really excited to hear where we agree and here we disagree. So let me start with characters. Who are your 5 favorite characters in 2017?
So the first one that I wanted to talk about is actually the character of Ego from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2.
Okay.
And I like this character predominantly because at first we were presented him as a sort of nurturing father figure who abandoned his child, feels a little bad about it, but is making steps to repair that relationship with his son, and is very excited and proud of his son. And then we get that heel turn.
Yeah.
So what I like about it is, as some people may have been able to derive from our conversations, problematic father figure characters are something that I understand. And it's not that I'm saying that my own father is I'm not demonizing my dad, but I do understand when characters have issues with their fathers at times. And so what the character of Ego did was sort of create a supernatural form of that for our main protagonist to deal with. And I loved the way in which his principal motivation is actually his own procreation.
Yeah.
And that it's sort of presented as other species do this, why can't I? And it's just sort of this very alien idea wrapped up in this very human character.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, I didn't love that movie as much as I had wanted to. I think in part because I'm really interested to hear you say that, because I was frustrated by that character. I wanted more out of it, but I think you're right. There's some really interesting things that are touched on. And I'm glad you got a lot more out of it than I did, because I think the dynamic between those two characters is such a fascinating one.
All right, so are we gonna do all of my 5, or are we gonna bounce back and forth?
Let's do your 5 and then my 5.
All right. Second one, I'm not even sure you're familiar with this character, but it is she's from the show on the CW, The 100, and it's the character of Clark.
Okay.
So I don't know, we don't have a ton of time, but just very briefly, Clark is, in a lot of ways, the main character of the show. She's a young adult woman who starts the show as sort of as a teenage woman who's thrust into having to have a leadership role in this post-apocalyptic future. And what I love about it is that the character struggles with many, many moral problems that exist in this world and with her society, and so she constantly has to be the person that makes the hard choice that she knows people aren't going to be okay with, but a choice has to be made, backs up against the wall, guns to her head, sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively, and she makes the call, and every time she makes the call, she's tortured or haunted by it, but she stands by it and she explains her reasoning and she's willing to take grief from her peers
Interesting.
about some of the things that she's done. She's a very complex character.
Yeah, the 100. I've not seen it, but it's one. I mean, we have such an embarrassment of riches right now. I used to be able to keep up with all of the Marvel and CW shows, and now I've just had to give up on most of the DC shows. I mean, on the CW. I've had to give up on most of those, but the 100 is definitely on my list of something I want to see at some point. And that sounds like a really interesting character, not one we see very often.
I think it'll take some getting into. The first couple of episodes start very much teenagers on the CW style of show
Okay,
before they really get into the richness of the world. So it's one
cool,
that's a bit of a hard sell at first, but there's a lot there if you
nice.
keep with it.
And I will use that actually. That I couldn't find a way to squeeze this into any of my lists, but the show that I am loving right now that just got started is Marvel's The Runaways, on
Mm,
Hulu, which also is very CW. But I gotta admit, I kind of like the CW like high school college romance stuff sometimes if done well. And
right.
Runaways is doing it great. I'm also going to make an executive decision and say I actually think it will go better if we go back and forth one by one. So
Yes,
let me give you two of mine on the top five, and then we'll go back and keep going one by one.
I like that. I like
The
that.
the first one I'm going to say is Frank Castle and the Punisher, and I know we're going to do a whole podcast on him sometime soon because the show. I mean, I think we both said it was really disturbing. It was really challenging, but I thought it was really well done. And to me, the character of Frank Castle is such a good one, especially because he is generally not one of my favorite characters. I generally find his portrayals to be very uber masculine, uber violent, and ever since he appeared in Daredevil, he has been instead almost more of like an anti-hero who really exists to pose questions for our other like he did such a good job of posing questions for Daredevil, and in his own show, the way it sort of flipped so many of the narratives that he is normally about in terms of toxic masculinity and the effects of violence and PTSD. Frank Castle is a character that I'm going to be thinking about and wrestling with for a long time.
I am not at all surprised to find he's on your top five list.
Yeah.
For all the reasons you just said.
And the second one is on my list, and I because I'm going to be able to find something good in Iron Fist, is the character of Colleen Wing. Um,
Oh yeah.
Colleen is the character who Danny gets involved with, who had been part of the Hand, and until she realizes that the Hand is much more evil than she thought they were to be. And I think one of the most interesting kind of stories is the story of what happens when a person realizes the thing that they have placed their ideals and their faith in is actually a lie. And what happens to your identity when such a large part of it is taken away and now you have to rebuild and figure out what do you believe in when everything you thought you believed in was wrong. Um, it got lost in a lot of Danny's story, but they did some really interesting things exploring that in both Iron Fist and in Defenders. That really made me want to know a lot more about the character of Colleen Wing, and really hoping we're going to see more of her in future Netflix shows.
Yeah, I agree. We saw some of her in Defenders, and one of the things I appreciated was that they gave her more of a role in Defenders than some of the other side characters, supporting characters had,
Yep,
because she was more directly tied to the antagonists, and I liked that.
yep. So who's number three on your list?
To the shock of absolutely nobody who listened to the Robots Are People 2 episode, I have Ada from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yeah,
Um, just a story that, and it's one that, I'll get into this a bit later, that one that I hope gets explored further, but it's, I couldn't help but feel for her character as somebody who was an artificial intelligence, uh, clearly self-aware, and being treated before she did anything wrong, before she did anything that was actually a problem, being treated as though, by at least some people, as though she's going to be the cause of our downfall,
yeah.
or is going to be a villain, is going to be another Ultron. Just so she's the subject of prejudice, and at the same time is just actually a person trying to be accepted, looking for that acceptance. Just such a powerful story for me, and one that I hope gets better treatment in the coming year.
I hope so too, and I think you're right. That's such an interesting dynamic, and it reminds me of a movie that I thought was a terrible movie, but raised some really interesting questions, and I did a podcast on a long time ago, which was Suicide Squad, because there's a line where Killer Croc says, "You treated me like a no." Amanda Waller says about him, "You treated me like a monster, so I became a monster."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that same thing can be applied to Ada, and it's a really interesting lesson. My third is actually also from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it's Gemma Simmons.
Oh, I love Simmons.
I think she's such a good character. I think her dynamics with Fitz have been so good. But at the end of last season, and also into this newest season, which I'm not going to spoil very much because some of you may not have seen much of the new Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but they're doing such an interesting thing with her character as, the Marvel world in general has always tried to be fairly strong on the idea of most of what we think of as mysticism is actually science. But especially on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they've been pushing that a little bit and starting to go into, are there actually some areas that aren't, that there might be a scientific explanation for, but that the line between science and mysticism is blurry. And you have some characters who are really embracing that, and I like that Gemma is the one who is most staunchly holding the line against that. She cannot accept a lot of these things. She is very dedicated to the science. And she's also very dedicated. I mean, she's probably the one who has the most trouble with the Inhumans and with Daisy being an Inhuman in some really interesting ways. I've always found her character to be incredibly charming, incredibly attractive, incredibly fun to watch on screen. And in the first couple seasons, I thought she was kind of a great comic addition to the show. I feel like recently, and especially this last year, she's really come into her own as being this incredibly rich character who offers a perspective that we really need in the sort of tension of the show's conversations.
And was not always presented as a completely flawless character from a moral perspective. You may recall a plot arc at one point in the show's history where Gemma was a little bit racist.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, against Inhumans, but still very much prejudice. And
oh yeah, I mean that. What I was saying there about her problems with Inhumans and with mystical stuff, that's not always presented as a good thing, and I like that about her. So what's your number 4?
My number 4 comes from the show Once Upon a Time, which is I would say it's a guilty pleasure, but I actually don't feel guilty about it at all. And it's the character of Mr. Gold / more recently Detective Weaver / his original name Rumpelstiltskin. So what I love about this character is that he is one of the most complex characters on the show. He comes from a place where he's clearly very self-motivated, but not, and a lot of things that he does seem as though they are just like straight up evil, right? Or just straight up selfish. And the more you learn about the character, the more you learn that there's such a complexity that he's so wrapped up in what he has around him and in what he wants. That he sometimes loses sight of what the right thing is to do, and he feels he is a lost cause. But he still struggles with this idea that, well, if I'm a lost cause, then I'm never going to be worthy of my family and worthy of Belle, the person that I love. And just seeing him slowly transform and sometimes regress back to being more of a villainous character, more of a selfish character, and then like fight against himself, that internal conflict. It's just
interesting.
It's always a privilege, and he's played so well.
Nice. That's another show I haven't seen, but I am curious about. But it does sound like an interesting character. My 4th is one that I know you haven't seen, and I'm going to be brief on because a lot of people haven't seen it. But my 4th favorite character was Luke Skywalker.
All right, turning my audio off now.
No, I'm not going to spoil anything. I promise. But I'll just say, in the original movies, Luke was never my most interesting character. I always thought he was a little bit boring, a little bit cliched. His character development in this is so good and so interesting. And I will say, and I'm if you want to bring on the hate for this, send me all the messages. I think Mark Hamill's portrayal of the Joker is absolutely fantastic, and I've even come to believe it's even better than Heath Ledger's. I think it's the best Joker we've ever had. I think Mark Hamill's laugh alone should win him awards because it is so good as the Joker. I think his portrayal as Luke Skywalker in this is the best acting he's ever done. Even better than the Joker. So I'm saying nothing more about what he actually does, but Luke Skywalker is absolutely one of my top 5 characters of this year.
Wow. All right, well, I'm excited. If people listening haven't figured it out, I have not yet, at the time we are recording this, seen The Last Jedi, so I will not be talking about it yet. But we will be talking about it once I've seen it.
Yep, no spoilers. So what's your number 5?
So this one might be coming a little bit out of left field, but from the Netflix series of Unfortunate Events, Violet Baudelaire. I was only ancillarily familiar with the series of unfortunate events stories prior to this show coming out. And when I watched the show, the thing that struck me the most was that the protagonists solve all of their problems with ingenuity and intelligence and deductive reasoning. And
Interesting.
Violet, in particular, is just she's brilliant. She's an inventor, and she's very rational in her approach to situations that are increasingly more traumatic and problematic for her brother, and her baby sister. So, very good heroic character for me.
Something else I haven't seen, but sounds good. I'm interested that we didn't have anyone overlap on our 5 lists. Although my last one I think is one you've seen, and I talked about it a lot on a podcast before, so I'll be very brief. But it's the character of Laura, or X-23, from the movie Logan, Wolverine's daughter. I just thought Logan is, I think, quite possibly of this genre, my favorite movie of this last year. And I just thought the way it got into portrayals, the way her character was portrayed as this both vision of hope, but also being so wrapped up in the brutality of the world of violence that Logan Wolverine is part of. Her character was just heartbreaking and so powerful to me.
Yeah, and I haven't seen Logan, but I heard the
Oh,
cast you
okay.
did on Logan.
Yeah,
Well, I listened obviously to every episode of the
right.
podcast prior to coming on. I'm not being facetious. I did in fact do that, and it made me want to see the movie,
Yeah, it's
and
a fantastic movie.
particularly that character made me want to see that movie. So
Well, and I'll use that to actually segue into the next one we're going to talk about is what were our 5 favorite ethical questions from this year, particularly ones we talked about in the podcast and that came up in media we saw. And my number one was that same thing. It was the effect of violence on us. I've always been I'm someone who's very interested in the question of violence, and I'm very frustrated by portrayals of violence that make it seem like doing harm to people, even if they're evil, has no moral consequences. And I have really loved how movies like Logan and shows like The Punisher have really explored what is the damage that happens to us when we do violence to other human beings, even when it's for good reasons.
yeah, I really enjoyed that particular question. I wish I could have been involved on it because I have thoughts, but I wasn't part of the cast yet.
I'm
This
sure we're going to talk about it when we go back to Punisher. But so
yeah,
yeah, what's your first question?
this top five list is harder for me because I was only involved in so many this year. Um, but sort of number one for me was the episode on real life heroes. The question
Yeah,
of what makes somebody a hero, and are we okay with heroes in our real life that have some flaws, and which ones do we not want to excuse, but still celebrate what they've done that's good, and which ones actually, like, is there one that undermines that heroic templating that we ascribe to them?
yeah. And that's that. So now we finally have a ding, ding, ding. One we both have on our lists. That was one of mine on my list as well. And I think that's a topic we're going to keep coming back to again and again. It's referenced in some other stuff that we're going to be seeing. And I think just this question of how we build legends and how we build mythology that we talked about just on the Orville recently is such a good one to explore. Um, so another one of my favorites is one from our very recent episode, which is this question of the episode we did on Thor Ragnarok, the idea of where do we find meaning and how does that differ from escapism? We just barely touched the surface of that question in terms of like what is the value of fluff and where do we still find meaning in things that are lighthearted, and also what's the value in escapism? Because I think for me as someone who is not just interested in these topics but lives these topics like you do, I know we both are very activist type people. Burnout is such a danger, and I know I feel guilty sometimes when I watch. You referred to Once Upon a Time as a guilty pleasure almost, but not really. I think that's an issue I hope we're going to keep coming back to because as fans, I think it's really easy to sort of get lost either in too much one way or the other, escapism or deep meaning. And I hope that's an issue we'll keep talking about.
Right. And that was one that I was delighted to record on when I thought we weren't going to have enough material for 40 minutes, and then
Yeah,
of course us being us, we
exactly.
talked for way too long. So second on my list, um, but probably first in my heart, the of course our artificial intelligences people.
Yep.
How do we deal with what is a person? How do we identify a person? How do we define personhood in entities that are not like us? Um, a question I feel we could possibly never fully explore in our lifetimes, but obviously one that has deep personal meaning for me because I feel very strongly about it.
Yeah, and I'm with you, and I will say that we're going to mention it briefly that this later for another question. That's an issue I even wish we'd been able to explore more in terms of the movie Blade Runner, because I think that it opens up so many questions about not just what is the nature of robotic life, but in that kind of great Star Trek-y way, what is life itself? Because I think so often we define things like life by what it isn't, and I think artificial intelligence is really making us start to question what is the nature of life and how do we define it and how do we not. Um, Another one that's on my list is the question of how do we fight fascism. We've done 2 episodes on this last year. One that Paul and I did, and one that you and I did on the questions of like how do our heroes fight Nazism and how to fight fascism and what can we learn about that in our own world. I don't think those problems are going away in the real world, and I think that's an issue that we're going to keep seeing. And I'm really curious I hope we keep exploring that because I think there's a lot we can learn, both positive and negative, about how our heroes fight these fights and how we can fight them ourselves.
Yeah. Like 5 seconds before we started recording this, I had that on my list as one of my five,
Yeah.
and I took it away because I decided I wanted one more on my list that wasn't one that I was on a recording for.
Cool.
Uh, so, but I absolutely agree. It was a great question and one that I feel we are going to continue to exploring, particularly with the problems in our current modern day society.
Yep.
Next up for me, this is one that I was not involved in the discussion on, but I love the question. This idea that this question of are heroes on higher ethical ground if they insist on fighting fair? The concept of a fair fight. I loved that episode that you and Paul
Good.
did. It was for me just a really good question and one that I like. You guys didn't fully explore it because again I feel it's very complex, but you did a very good job of talking at it from multiple different angles, and it's one that's an interesting idea because there is this idea about a fair fight makes you ethically superior, but does it? And is it
Yeah.
like and do the ends justify the means kind of idea is just one that I'm excited to explore more.
Well, good, and that's one I hope we revisit. Because it was one that's very dear to my heart. The other one that's on my list, because as I said we've overlapped a little bit, but is the idea of the hero's journey. And I talked about this on a wonderful podcast where Becky Allen was our guest. We talked about the Star Wars story, and I'm just really interested in this question of do we tell stories about one individual person who comes in and saves everything, or do we tell it more about group efforts? And we haven't talked about it on the podcast yet because you haven't seen it, but I put up an article on the website about my concerns with or why I didn't love the movie Justice League. And one of the big reasons is because I thought it wound up being more about Superman saving the day instead of the team saving the day. And that's an issue that I'm really glad we talked about on that podcast because I think it cuts across so much of the media that we talk about on this show.
Yeah, and it was again that is not a point of overlap. So I have two more on this,
Yep.
but it is an issue worth exploring, and I at some point we'll probably see Justice League to be able to talk about it. I still haven't seen Wonder Woman. That's where I'm at in terms of like I feel like I'm committing a cardinal sin at this point in not having seen Wonder Woman. So
Yeah.
I got a lot of
Wonder
guilt.
Woman's fantastic. You got to see it.
Yes, yeah. So next up for me. The question of policing and controlling superpowers, telepath
Yeah.
specifically for the episode that I was on, but also talking about you guys did an episode talking about Shield, and was Lex Luthor right in this whole idea of metahumans are actually a severe risk to our society and they need to be very strongly controlled? Is Tony Stark right? That we need to be heavily regulated, we need to be put in check, or is there something to be said for in order for heroes to be effective, they need a level of autonomy because if they're answerable to a government, now that government's agenda is going to be what is pushed rather than what is quote right unquote.
It's funny. I didn't think of that question because that question and the discussion about Civil War was what started this whole podcast and blog. But so I'm so glad you listed it. And so, what's your number 5?
Number 5, it's very on a very similar vein, but is Magneto right?
Oh
Loved
yeah,
that episode, loved that question. The idea that here's just someone who's definitely presented to us as an antagonist, not but a hero of his own story, right? And uh, I loved the fact that, and one of the reasons I want to watch Logan is that the idea that actually yes, it turns out Magneto kind of was right. Maybe he was part of, like, maybe he fulfilled his own prophecy, but in a lot of ways what he was driving at for the future of mutants um did need that kind of action, and did rely on the idea that you can't solve the inherent mistrust between humans and mutants. But that's really upsetting as an
yeah.
idea.
And I think, yeah, that's. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that was another one of my favorite episodes, and one that I've not been thrilled with a lot of the X-Men movies, but more recently, although some have been very good. But I know there is another X-Men movie coming out, and I really hope we dig more into some of those questions. Um, and that's a good segue also for the next one we're going to talk about is what are the 5 things we're most excited to see explored in 2018? So start us off, Jacob. What are you most excited to see?
All right, so I actually have this kind of split into two different things. I've got some things that are media that I know is coming out in 2018 that I'm excited to see, uh, and hope to see explored, and then also things for the podcast. So the first thing
Yeah,
is Jessica Jones season 2.
yeah,
What I'm most excited about in Jessica Jones season 2 is I want to see, does she start coping better with her trauma? Does she start coping in more healthy ways? Or is this something that is just going to continue to drive her down? Is this something that is going to be a demon she struggles with for multiple episodes, well past the death of Kilgrave?
yeah. I actually list that on a different question, but I think you're right. That is going to be such an important one, where I feel like Jessica Jones took that character to such a good place. And one of my frustrations in the Defenders is I felt like they didn't really take her any further. And I'm really excited to see where we're going to get her go. Get to see her go when we get back to her having her own show. I think one of the things I'm most excited about in 2018 is getting to see Wakanda.
Oh
I'm so
yeah, Black
excited.
Panther is in 2018.
Yeah, and
Sorry, I
it's
got really
soon.
excited when you said that.
It's soon. I think it's like February or March. And I am so. I mean, I think there's just so much that could be so amazing about this movie. But there's just a degree to which, like, the Wakanda, and I've heard a number of black authors and podcasters talk about this in ways that have really moved me. That Wakanda is just, it is such a powerful idea of a black nation, an African nation that has been utterly free of colonialism. And just imagining what, and it's horrifying in some ways to think that in order to imagine what that, you have to be completely fictional to imagine what that would look like. But I think that's going to be so powerful for us to see. And I'm sure we're going to get a huge backlash, and I'm kind of enjoying that, because I kind of like listening to the idiots yell about we don't have any white heroes anymore. And I'm going to be a little amused by that, because I think this is going to be such a great movie. And I'm just really excited to see what the world of Wakanda is going to be like.
Yeah, I am too. I'm so glad you brought that up because I actually forgot. I wasn't gonna forget when I saw the first trailer for it again, but yeah, that is very exciting for me. So next up on my list, talking about Star Wars. Next year, Solo is coming out. Um,
Ooh.
so this is where we get Han Solo's backstory, and I'm very excited about that because it's something that I feel is going to give us a lot of things to talk about. Because I feel like in order to give us the character we saw in A New Hope, there
Mm-hmm.
has to be some troubling stuff in his past and some, like, probably morally problematic stuff in his past, and I want to see the events that formed that character so badly.
Here where we differ. This is the first of the Star Wars movies I am really not excited about. I
Interesting.
I like Rogue One. To me, is the perfect kind of prequel because it fills in a part of the story without telling us more stuff about a character. To me, the with movies like like Solo, so often it's because the movie has to get to a certain point. I just wind up watching the movie thinking this doesn't feel right, or this doesn't feel accurate, or actually this changes things in ways I don't like. I almost just never like those movies. I hope you're right, because I think there's a real possibility for it to be really good. I'll admit I'm going in with a lot of trepidation. But let's see what
Fair.
happens.
Fair.
Um, I'm super excited for Infinity War.
Oh
Um,
yeah, of course.
they have built it up so much, and of course there's a possibility it's going to flop and it's just going to be too over built up. But And here again, there's one part of it where I'm excited because I think it's going to raise some great questions for us for the podcast, especially because you have a number of different heroes who all have different ways of operating. I mean, already the Avengers are starting to come apart, have come apart in some ways, and now you throw like imagine Steve Rogers trying to get along with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, talk about completely, Rocky and Steve have very different ideas of what's okay. And I think there's going to be some great questions, as well as I just think that's going to be a really fun movie. I'm really excited for Infinity War.
Yeah, I am excited for Infinity War as well. I have it on a different list, but that is interesting that we're overlapping now between
Yep.
lists. Um,
What's
so
your next one?
next one up for me is actually the next season of, or this current season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the continuation of it. There's this whole Inhuman auctioning plot line in the current season that
Mm-hmm.
I'm just hyper fascinated in, like where they're going with this and what this is doing. Like they fast forwarded to the future, they've jumped into the future, and then also based on the most recent episode, um, because I know Fitz is going to be in the mix again, I am very fascinated in the continuation of the will they won't they get together on a more permanent basis of Leopold Fitz and Gemma Simmons.
Yeah.
I shipped them pretty hard, actually, and it's been torturous to see the writers pull out all the tricks for like driving a spike through their possible relationship. And
Yeah.
I want them, I want to actually have a happy resolution, but I'm also fine with a continuation
That
of
one was
drama.
definitely on my list as well. Especially because at the end of in the framework which we saw in the last season, Fitz is probably the person who goes the deepest into it and winds up acting the most against his character in ways that are clearly horrifying to everyone else. And I think I'm hoping that the payoff to that is going to come in this season and is really going to be good. Another thing I'm really excited for in 2018, and I don't know exactly which show we're going to get it in, but I've been told we're probably going to get this in the Luke Cage, which is coming out. I really want to see Misty Knight become the full superhero she can be. I want to see the bionic arm. I wish Tony Stark was building it instead of Danny Rand, but even so, there was a great
Dan
panel I
Rand's just
saw
paying for it. He doesn't know tech.
Exactly. There was a great panel I saw at the WisCon, this amazing feminist sci-fi conference here in Madison every Memorial Day, that was on specifically the women of Luke Cage, and it talked a lot about Misty Knight and what a powerful character she is. And I'm really excited to see where they go with her. I think she's been a great part of the show already, but especially as now, she's been one of the ones who at first was like the cop who thought Luke was doing the right thing, but still it was outside the law, so she had to stop him. And there's been this slow evolution of her across a number of shows, moving away from being a cop, moving to more embracing vigilante issues. And so to watch her now complete that journey and become a full-on superhero herself, working probably outside the law, I'm really excited for that story.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Although it didn't make my list because it didn't occur to me honestly. Um, but yeah, I didn't realize we're getting Misty Knight as a character independently. I hoped we would be, and that we'd have maybe like a buddy cop thing between. Oh my goodness, why is my brain no longer working for names? We were just talking about her. She was in Iron Fist.
Oh, Colleen Wing.
Yes, between Misty
Yeah.
Knight and Colleen Wing. Thank you. Uh, because I feel like that there's a lot of material to be mined in that show, and they already
Yeah, I
work
mean, that's
together a little
Daughters of the
bit.
Dragon.
Yep,
That's the Daughters of the Dragon comic series, was
yep,
those two.
yep.
So
Uh,
what's your next one?
so my next one actually has to do with we're expanding our horizons in the coming year for the types of media we're covering. There are some books that we're going to be talking about. There's a series I just started, and I'm already very excited to start digging into talking about the books in the series. The Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson. I'm currently
Mm.
reading Way of Kings. I'm very excited to delve into this other form of media to mine for these kinds of questions and things to talk about.
Nice. I will admit I'm not loving those books as much as you and Rob are. So it may well be that that's one more of those podcasts where I mostly leave it to you. Rob is a good friend of ours who introduced us to these books and will be a guest when we talk about them. But definitely I'm curious to hear what you guys get out of those books. Um, and my last one, it's one that I'm gonna have to be careful of because uh, I'll just say the last thing that I'm excited about, but with some mixed feelings, is the next of the Harry Potter world, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them movies. I'm troubled about it because of the revelations about Johnny Depp, and I'm probably gonna see if I can find a way to watch the movie without giving it any money. But I loved the way they brought up the world, the way they expanded the world in the first Fantastic Beasts movie, especially the way it wasn't a Gryffindor hero, the way it was an obvious Hufflepuff hero, and how much he challenged ideas of masculinity. I'm really hoping we get to see a Slytherin hero in this next one, because you and I are both underrepresented Slytherins who know we just don't get enough love. So that's my secret hope for the new Harry Potter movie. But even if we don't get that, I'm just really excited to see something else in the Harry Potter world. Again, I really wish we didn't have Johnny Depp in it, and I hope that finally gets fixed going forward. But I am excited to see where they take how they expand the world.
I'm similarly excited for that movie, largely because Newt Scamander is one of my favorite protagonists in recent history, just because he's so different from any other protagonist. He's gentle and kind, and he's not an action hero.
He's not an alpha male.
Yeah, he fights with his compassion, and it's I love it.
Yep.
Hits me right here. Last thing that I'm excited about, and this is as much a thing I'm excited about for 2018 as it is a commitment from myself to the listeners. I am going to start diving into the world of graphic novels and comics. It's something that I've wanted to explore for a while, and I feel like it'd help inform some of our discussions on these media that are being shown to us on television and in movies, as well as possibly be sources of conversations all on their own. So I'm excited to hopefully bring some of that to the podcast in the coming year.
Yep. So let's jump into the next question. What are your five concerns for 2018? What are things that you're nervous about or worried about?
I'm going to start with the big one. We've already touched on it a little bit, but it's Ready Player One.
That is number one on my list, too.
Yep. Number one on our list, number 5,000 in our hearts. So I know this is apparently a very contentious statement on my part, but I found Ready Player One to be one of the most damaging pieces of fiction I have consumed in probably my entire life. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's got everything that we talked about in the Gatewatch episode that I dislike, the Geek Boy fantasy thing. It's got the gariest stew of Gary stews. It's got this like really bad relationship, romantic. The romance plot is so bad. And if you read the book, I know a lot of people are in love with the story. If you actually read the book critically, I think you will find that it is not a good book. And I don't know how it's going to go onto the big screen and not be just a tire fire.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about it. I have such an 80s nostalgia love that there was so much about that book that spoke exactly to my childhood that I did love, and I disagree with you about the critical reading of the book. But especially, the way that romantic storyline gets played out. I am really hoping that Spielberg recognizes that and realizes you shouldn't make a movie with that kind of a storyline in 2018 and changes it, but it's definitely something I'm very concerned about. That's number one on my list.
And don't get me wrong, like the 80s, the 80s quote unquote, because there's some stuff referenced from the 70s and the 90s in there as well that was all classic quote unquote. But that scratched an itch for me, but it's pandering, and I know. Sorry.
Yeah. Second on my list is the one, and I'll just say it briefly because you already talked about it. My second concern is what are they going to do with Jessica Jones? Because I do feel like her character stagnated a bit in Defenders, and as we've talked about in other parts of the show, they made the alcoholism more a comedy note instead of a serious note. I'm excited for her show. I'm concerned about where they're going to develop her.
Yeah, I have that very same concern. I'm optimistic. Because I prefer to be optimistic and then be disappointed. Yep. But yeah, I'm right there with you on that. And then riffing off of that, Infinity War, which you brought up, that's actually one of my concerns for 2018, is that I'm concerned that Infinity War is honestly just going to be a dumb action flick. When so many of the things that led up to it had some nuance, had some interesting things to talk about, but it's culminating in there's going to be a lot of characters, a huge cast, and it is predominantly based on a conflict with Thanos acquiring the Infinity Gems, socketing them in the Infinity Gauntlet, and trying to effectively control the universe. Like,
Yeah.
it's probably going to be an action flick, but maybe there will be cool things to talk about.
And so clearly concerns is where we most overlap, because that was also one of my concerns, and I had a specific one, which is the Civil War conflict going to be forgotten? Because I think we left the movie Civil War with this huge gaping, valley between where Cap is and where Tony is, and I will be so happy if that gets paid off in some way in Infinity War, if it becomes, well, we totally disagree, but Thanos is here, so let's forget about our disagreement and fight him. I'm going to be really disappointed.
Yeah.
So I'm with you there. The next one on my one, and it's kind of related to this, and it's more of an overall trend, but is I have been getting concerned, and the DC movies especially have done this for me, but as Hollywood gets more and more into the big budget, huge tentpole superhero movies, we're losing out on small budget, not even indie movies, but just the idea of movies that explore deeper issues and aren't just all about explosions and whiz-bang stuff. And obviously it seems kind of weird for a podcast about superhero movies and praising them to be talking about this, but I am a little concerned about what's going to happen to the film industry as we keep going this direction. In a lot of ways, I think the best superhero media these days is being created on the small screen, on Netflix and stuff like that, where you don't have the big budget. I don't really know where this is going to go, and I don't think it's all going to be bad, but it's definitely a concern I have, is what is going to happen to the economic future of the industry, and are we going to be able to keep seeing the really deep story issues explored, or are we going to see more and more of the huge, where all the money is going into the action budget?
Right. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, our podcast is clearly sponsored by Netflix for how much we elevate its
Yep.
Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff over the others. But actually, that segues very nicely into into one of my problems or concerns. I'm concerned we're going to get more shows like Punisher. And I don't mean that Punisher was bad. I don't mean I'm sitting there saying I dislike Punisher. But there is a revenge fantasy element to Punisher that I very much found a problem. And also a pandering to different kinds of ideologies that I felt was it felt disingenuous on the writer's part, and therefore I felt like they shouldn't have been doing it. And I dislike that. I dislike going, well, we know there's an audience for this, so we're going to do it, even though we don't agree with it.
I think that's a really good point, and I'm reminded of there's a commentary track on the Hunger Games movie, and the director said something I thought was really fascinating, which is he said, look, the whole point of the Hunger Games books is to critique the media culture of violence, and they were very concerned that in showing a movie about this, that they would be replicating the same problem, because, and his exact words were, if kids walk out of the movie wanting to recreate the fight scenes from the Hunger Games movie, then we've failed.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was such an interesting way, and I think in some ways, as much as I love The Punisher, I think The Punisher failed in that same kind of way, in that it was trying to tell a story about just how problematic revenge fantasies are, but in a way that people who love revenge fantasies still got a lot out of. And that one we're going to totally dive into, but I think you're right. That's a real good concern. My last concern, and again, this is kind of a broad, the state of the industry thing, but it's the idea of the backlash that we're seeing. There is such good things happening in terms of how progressive we are getting with these stories, that we're getting many more stories about women, many more stories about people of color, many more stories about queer characters, but there's a growing backlash, and we saw it with Ghostbusters and just how awful it can be. I am concerned about the conflicts within fandom and how they're going to play out in the coming year, as we get a lot more stories about characters who are not white men.
To be clear, when you're saying how awful it can be, you're talking about how awful the backlash is, not how awful Ghostbusters is, right?
Oh no, God!
Because otherwise,
no,
we're gonna
exactly.
have words.
I think it's fantastic that we're getting all of this new media that's not just giving us white men anymore.
Right.
But I think we need to really wrestle with the fact that there's a very toxic part of our fandoms that we haven't figured out how to stop the damage they can do.
Yeah, if we haven't made it clear to our listeners already, both Matthew and I are unabashed progressives. So sorry in
Just a
advance
little
if
bit.
that's a
Just a
problem
little
for
bit.
you, but sorry, not sorry, I guess. Uh, so
Did you have any? I know we want to move quickly. Did you have any more concerns, or is there? Can we move on to the last
yeah,
question?
I have two more concerns. Real quick,
Go for it.
let's go boom boom on them. So we have the Ada plotline in Agents of Shield has basically gone the way of the dodo. Because we came into this season as a completely new plot thread, completely new story, and I'm concerned we're just not going to revisit it. We're not going to pay any service to it. That they're all like, well, we're done with that. We're going away now and doing this other thing, or that it's going to turn out that this future is in a large part due to Ada, and like all of our protagonists will have been proven right in their concerns. And oh my god, what a pile of trash that will be. Sorry, not
Totally
sorry.
with you there. What's the last concern?
Last one is, and we just talked about this, but the Orville not dealing with the Moclan cultural changes and with Yaphet's
Yeah.
rape of Claire Finn. I really am concerned that they're not going to touch on it at all, and I will lose a lot of investment in that show if those don't get paid off.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think that's been my biggest concern with the show Orville. I've liked it a lot. That was one of the latter episodes, and the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I'm really hoping we get some payoff there, and if not, it may really change my ability to enjoy that show, let alone keep watching it. So, because the other thing that about the two of us, we love to talk. We are both very progressive, and we love self-flagellation.
Self-flagellation. We don't love
Pronunciation is
pronouncing things well, but we love self-flagellation.
Well, now I can talk about how bad my pronunciation is. But the point is, let's dive into what are the 5 things we missed. 5 things we wish we had talked about more.
I imagine there's going to be a lot of overlap here.
Yep.
So, first off, one I'm going to throw out immediately is, because this is on me, caging our commentary about real-life heroes who did something bad. We did not do a very good job on that, and we got a comment on it that I'm very thankful for, because going back and listening, I completely understood where that person was coming from, and how what I personally said was interpreted that way, and that I felt very bad about that. We could have done a much better job of being very clear that we were not saying, hey, if you were somebody who beat your wife, you're still going to be a hero and okay in our books if you did good things.
Yeah, and clearly what we're saying there is that was what you said by accident. And when I said a little bit, and we were absolutely not meaning to say that, because I think that was one where I think we were not clear enough. That something like domestic violence or anything like that would you wouldn't be able to still see a person as a hero when something like that happens. That's definitely something I think we definitely could have been clearer on. In general, I think a lot of times we're not clear enough with our words, but specifically on that issue, I think we both could have been better. One that I think that I wish we had done is, I wish that we had both seen the movie Blade Runner before we had done that. And I wish I had seen the movie Blade Runner before we did that podcast on the Robot Overlords.
Agree.
Because Blade Runner is such a good movie, the new one, and does such interesting things about robot, where's the line between human and robot life. Let's make sure we do a podcast about that in 18, because that was definitely one we missed.
Agree. And that actually leads very nicely into, because same kind of thing, there's a lot to talk about there in the ascribation of personhood, but that actually leads very nicely into the next one I have, which is that episode. I wish we had identified more cases where we were definitely not going to ascribe personhood to an entity that had some of the markers. Like, we didn't do a very good job of defining, like, what we find a line of, okay, this is a person. At this point, this is clearly a person. We never said, okay, here's an example. Like you mentioned a Roomba, right? But it was like it was kind of a throwaway joke thing. And it is possible we couldn't actually nail that down, but it would have been interesting to try to be like, okay, can we find a line where like this is not and this is?
Yeah, no, I think that would have been helpful, because like sometimes you need that in a conversation. Another thing that I think we missed, and I think is now being fixed, is I wish that I'd seen the show Avatar before we had that podcast about it, because oh my god, do I love that show now. We are definitely going to be talking about it more again. I thought in some ways it was good for me to be able to step back and let you and Paul really run that discussion. But I'm also now, as I watch the show, there's all these moments where I'm like, oh my God, I could have said this on the podcast. Because it's just such a good show.
Yeah, a show for children, rife with things to talk about on superhero ethics. We were right, but so I'm gonna get my self-serving point out of the way now. One
Go
of the
for it.
things I missed was not being involved for the first part of the year, because I didn't know about it.
Yeah, that's that. Well, so that's my failure in marketing, my failure in developing a friendship with you earlier.
Right, right. What is wrong with you?
Clearly.
But that's
No,
kind of a throwaway miss because this is a top 5 list, and I was struggling because I've only been involved in the podcast for like 6 months.
that's fair. That's fair. No, and I think you've done a great job of stepping in. And on the one hand, I'm glad that you've been able to step in while Paul had to step back. But I'm also really excited for more of the three of us talking.
Yeah,
Um,
I loved the Avatar episode because it gave me an opportunity
yeah.
to talk with Paul. That was so good.
And I'll say that ties into what's another one of my top five that I think we missed, which is I really wish we were doing more to generate better audience feedback. I know our listener numbers keep going up, and I'm so glad for that. And I've been getting a lot of, like, we'll get comments in different places or an email and things like that. I think we need to do more to encourage discussion about these issues to continue on places like Facebook and Twitter. And it's certainly one of my goals, and it's something I think we've missed because I think the best thing about a podcast like this is when it engages the audience and we get to have those continuing conversations.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. That I want to be engaged with the audience as the audience grows, especially, and really understand like what they are interested, what they like, what they dislike, but also like want them to be part of that conversation and maybe get some of them on as guest hosts.
Yeah,
You don't
definitely.
have to be an expert on a topic. Goodness knows we're not, and
We
we're
are
sitting here
definitely
talking for
not.
hours at a time about these things. So,
What's your next one?
so the next one. This is again a little bit self-serving, but and I alluded to it way in the beginning. I wanted to do an episode on Once Upon a Time, but I couldn't
Yeah,
find a good central theme to focus it on, because there's a lot to talk about actually about the show. But now the show is done and we've started up a completely different plot line, and I'm worried I'm like missed the boat, missed the chance of getting in on it right as the last season was concluding.
mm. Yeah, and it's one where I watched an episode of the show or two itself, and I didn't really get hooked in. But I think the larger questions of fairy tales and fairy tale stories that I know that show explores, especially in revisiting it in modern day, just seems so fascinating to me. So I definitely think there's a lot we can talk about there. Um, One other that I have on my list is, and we talked about it briefly, so I'll just repeat it. Um, I don't think we've talked enough about the problems in fandom.
Yeah,
I think we've touched on it, but there is. You and I also we did an episode on Magic the Gathering, and we are now becoming very aware of the toxicity in the Magic world. But certainly we know about the toxicity in all of these fandoms. And I do think it's something I want to make sure we touch on more, and not just like to say, hey, this is how it's bad, but to really talk about what are the things that we do that may encourage it, and what are the things we can do to combat it.
right. Especially, what are the things that how can we engage with these people and get them to realize the problems without actually attacking them, right? Because that never gets
Yep.
somebody on your side if you just attack them and demonize them. Uh, Great topic for conversation, and I wish we had done more on that, but we've got time, right? And this is a good time to start talking about how we want to approach that conversation. Last thing on my list is, and I posted about this when I shared the episode, but completely missed the boat about talking about the character of Valkyrie in our Thor
Yep.
Ragnarok discussion, and I absolutely should have. That character is amazing, a very strong character, a very competent character, one with some depth and some backstory, something that we normally would have talked about. And it was after the episode went up, or shortly before we were going to post it, I realized, hey, we didn't talk about her at all. And that was a huge miss on my part. So I guess on our part, but I don't want to speak for you. Um, and something that I wish we had done. I wish we had talked about her character as well, rather than fanboying off about Thor and Loki and their tsundere relationship.
Hmm. No, and this is kind of funny. That's on my list too. It's actually number 2 on my list,
Hmm.
and I've been intentionally skipping it because I knew it was one you had first told me about and made me realize. So
Matthew,
I
it was
wanted you to
number
be the
2
one.
on my list, and I was intentionally skipping it because your point segued into mine so nicely.
Oh, okay, that works too. But it kept being like Jacob is gonna kill me if I'm the one to mention this because this is totally one he should get credit for. But yeah, no, that's so good. We get to close out on one we agree on. Um, Well, good. This was a great way to kind of like look back at the year and to think about what we want to do for the coming year. Um, I want to give you a chance to do any closing thoughts, but I want to mention just 2 other quick lists that I want to mention, and let you jump into because we don't have to be on exactly 5. But the first one I want to say is I want to give you 5 other content creators I really think you should be paying attention to because I think obviously we're the best. But there are a lot of good people doing really good things on some of this stuff that I really want to make sure we highlight. Um, and the first is I mentioned her before already, but Becky Allen. Um, she was our guest on the episode about Star Wars and the hero's journey. She had fantastic thoughts about that. I first encountered her at WisCon where she was on a panel. She's just published her second novel in a fantasy series that I know is exploring some really great issues. She is someone her thoughts to definitely check out because I think they're really good. Um, a second is a podcast called Stealing the Remote. It's one I've just gotten connected with recently. It's a hilarious idea where it is a guy who is a big fan of this kind of superhero and sci-fi and geek stuff, is watching a lot of them with his mother, and talking about them. And a lot of them, she has no idea the kind of context these are coming from. And it's both a hilariously funny podcast, but it's also just a great way um, to be reminded of how different these products look to someone who is steeped in this world versus to someone who's outside them, and how both can enjoy them. Um, a third that I want to highlight is JP Fairfield, who was another one of our guests. She came on to talk about Arrow, and she's part of a podcast called Nerdgasm Noire, which is a number of black women talking about these issues, issues in terms of like superhero and nerdy things. It's a great podcast, a really different perspective than I think a lot of what you hear online about these things. Really worth checking out. And the last 2, and they're kind of linked in my head because they're very similar. The MCU podcast and the DC On Screen podcast. They each focus on either the Marvel world or the DC world, and they both do a great job of going really in depth into the issues that are raised, as well as just talking about like what makes the movies great or TV shows great or what doesn't make them great. They're very critical when they need to be, and I get a lot of my ideas, and I pretty openly steal from them all the time, from those 2 sets of podcasters.
Oh, I thought you
I'll
were
have
all
links to all
original.
of that. No, yeah, no, we're all totally original. Every thought I have is completely original. I'll have links to all 5 of those in the podcast notes. But Jacob, is there any others you would want to throw onto a list of other content you want people
So
to be checking out?
I mean, I kind of do only because I like sharing things that I'm into. I like sharing podcasts that I personally enjoy, but they don't really have a lot of overlap with this. Is that okay, or?
Yeah, just throw out 1 or 2.
All right, so I'll throw out one that actually does link into something we talked about earlier, but it's called 372 Pages We'll Never Get Back, and it is, in my opinion, the one of the better dissections of the story Ready Player One. Um, and it is by 2 Riff Tracks hosts, and it is very funny and it is very short. It's just a read through of the book, and they talk with each other about different scenes. They have some fun stuff that do alongside, but I think it's enjoyable. It's worth checking out. It's a short listen because it's not a continuous podcast. Um, Another one that I would, uh, I guess that's the only one that actually like ties into the show. So there are others that I'm listening to, but they're not particularly relevant right now. There is one that I love,
Uh
that
huh.
maybe we'll do an episode on, called Welcome to Night Vale. If you are not already familiar with Welcome to Night Vale, it is a uh, played as a radio show in a sort of Cthulhian, Eldritchian horror world in the middle of the desert in America, and it's half comedy, half horror, and half introspection on human existence and human relations. So it's 150% of a show, which is a lot of value.
Nice. Yeah, that's one I keep seeing referenced and keep wanting to check out. And so the last list I'm going to do is five. This is my Christmas wish list to you guys, or my holiday wish list to you all. Whatever you all are celebrating. Five things that I'm going to ask you, our listeners, to do to help the podcast. If you're interested in helping us continue to grow and to get this great discussion out to others, these are five things that if you can do any of them are so appreciated. One is leave us a review on iTunes. Stitcher, I think you can also do it, but especially on iTunes. The more reviews we get, especially 5-star reviews, but any reviews, it helps to push us higher up on those searches so that people who are looking for this kind of thing and have never heard of us can find us. And also, even if it's a negative review, it lets us know what can we be doing better. Jacob and I are both people who love feedback, who want to grow, who want to get better. Tell us your thoughts. Tell us how we can do better. Leave us a review on iTunes. The second is the Facebook and Twitter conversations. We're going to be doing a lot more to try to better encourage those. But if you've listened to the podcast, if you have a thought about it, if you want to agree with us, if you want to tell us how wrong we are, go especially to the Superhero Ethics Facebook page or Twitter account and send us a message there. We'd love to have conversations with you. We've had a couple of them actually recently, and they've been really fun. Keep those conversations going with us. Another thing you can do is share this with friends. If you're listening to this podcast, it's probably because you're big old geeks like us, and you want to be having these conversations with people over beer or over a meal sometime the same way we do. Share them with your friends. The biggest way this podcast has been spreading is through word of mouth, and people just forwarding a link to someone else and saying, "Here, check this out." Please keep doing that. Please help keeping us to get the word out to others. And another one which I know Jacob submitted was to keep giving us ideas for content to cover and questions to explore. We have a ton of things we want to talk about, but I'd love to hear, I know we both would love to hear more from you all. What are the things you want us to cover? What are the topics that you think we're missing that we need to do more on, and that you would just find an episode on really interesting? And then my last is just keep listening. It's been about 1.5 years since I started this project, and we are finally now on a better software to track our downloads. And I have just been so amazed and so touched seeing how high those download numbers are going, and seeing that we have listeners, from what I can tell, not just all over the country, but all over the world. So in particular, I want to say hello to our listeners in Pakistan and in Brazil and in Serbia. I have no idea how you found your way here, but I'm so glad you're part of our listener base. And to all of you, just keep listening, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening, and thank you for being a part of this. So those are my five. Jacob, is there anything else you would have?
No, the submitting ideas one is the one that's crucial for me, because a lot of the things that we've had to talk about have come from one of us. We get the spark, we get the inspiration. We're like, oh, okay, we can talk about this, or we saw something recently, and so we can talk about this. But we have gotten a couple where somebody brought something up, and they're in our queue, and we're like, yeah, that is good. And I like that so much for two reasons. One, it helps do some of the work for us. That's obviously exceedingly selfish, but I'll take it. But the second is that it means that we have that level of engagement, and it gives us some opportunity to maybe invite people on. And yeah, don't be shy if you think that. So yeah, one thing I would like to add: don't be shy if you think, hey, I've got enough to contribute to this particular conversation. You want to get in touch with Matthew or I and say, hey, I'm interested in talking about this. Would you consider having me be a guest on your show? I'm totally okay with that. The worst thing we're going to say is we're not going to really fit that in our schedule right now. But honestly, we love having these conversations with people that aren't each other, because we can talk to each other all the time. So that's a great way you can join in.
Absolutely, that's 100% the case. And I will say that I know one of the episodes I'm excited that we will do in the next year is one of our listeners submitted, and I forget who, but we have it written down, but submitted the idea that we do a podcast on sidekicks, on characters like Robin from Batman and Robin, and sort of what are the ethics around them, which I've always thought, to me, one of the little bit of a black marks on Batman's record is that he takes a 14-year-old boy and throws him out into the middle of danger on a regular basis. So yeah, I'm excited for that, and I'm excited for any of the kind of content you guys can come up with. So once again, 2017 has been a fantastic year. Thank you to Paul for all he did. Thank you to all of our guest hosts. Jacob, thank you so much to you for being a part of this. And all of you, our listeners, thank you so much for listening. Please keep spreading the word, keep talking to people, leave us reviews, be on the conversations. Most of all, keep listening. I hope 2017 was as good for you as it could be, and I hope for only good things for all of us in 2018. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much. Have a great day.